This is unSILOed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Claudia Goldin, who is a professor of economics, but of course you're also an historian, and also the author of many books. A couple of them, Women Working Longer, Race Between Education and Technology, the Defining Moment, Understanding the Gender Gap, and of course, most recently, this book right here, Career and Family, Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equity. Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you very, very much. And the book is out in paper, and the cover for the paper edition is very different because publishers think that they have to have things that are really simple and really flashy. So the cover is not artistic, it's just flashy.
Well, I think it doesn't need to be flashy on the surface because it really is fascinating on the inside.
Well, that's really, really good. Unfortunately, when people walk into a bookstore, they don't see the inside until they take the book that's flashy and open it up.
Cambridge might be one of the few places where people still actually do go into bookstores, right?
I think bookstores are big in many, many different places. Then again, maybe I only go to college towns because I was just thinking that I was in Hanover recently and we went into a bookstore and we thought, wow, what a great experience. We can open things up.
Right. Well, the thing about this book is that it really ties together a lot of the different threads that you've been working on your entire life, right? So you've been working on labor markets, you've been working on the gender gap, you've been working on education, you've been working on technology. And I think it all kind of comes together in this book. And in this book, you use a little bit of economic theory, you delve into all of these different data sources. And I think you're trying to answer this fundamental question, which is, why do we have this gap in income between males and females in the United States? And in order to kind of set the stage to answer that question, you go way back in time, over 100 years ago, and trace how this has evolved. And you talk about kind of 5 different generations, and I guess we're kind of in the 5th generation. And I love how you kind of set it up where you said that the first group had to choose either career or family. And then the second group was typically going to do job and then family. These are sort of the prototypical sequences. The third was family, then job. The fourth was career, then family. And you make a distinction between jobs and careers. And now, of course, we live in the era where everybody wants to have it all, right? To have a wonderful career and a family. And you limit it really, the book, it took me a couple pages for me to figure this out. You're really focusing on college graduates, right? And of course, college graduates, female college graduates, they were much smaller in number in the earlier periods than they are now. And the other thing that I found fascinating is that the ratio of male and female college graduates was, at the beginning of this time period, relatively equal. Compared, and like it is now. And it was really this temporary blip that was due to the GI Bill that led to this massive disparity between male and female college graduation rates.
So do you want me to respond?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even have a question in there. I don't know where my question was.
You don't have a question, but I know from your writing that you are big into elevator pitches. And you just gave the most amazing pitch for my book, but we would have reached beyond the top floor of the Empire State Building.
That's right. Well, luckily my listeners.
So unless,
patience.
Of course, the elevator got stuck, in which case I would have been greatly entertained. Let me just add a couple of things to the elevator pitch, which is that the reason that the book was written in the way it was is it really splices, as you said, 2 separate parts of my work. The historical work that reaches way back and the work that begins sort of yesterday that says, if women are doing so well uh, if they are graduating from college, not equal to men, but actually greatly, greatly exceeding. If they are going to law school at about the same rate, if they're getting MDs at about the same rate, why do even they look as if they've been sideswiped, okay, in terms of their earnings and in terms of their promotions, in terms of what they would consider their careers? Why do they look like they've been sideswiped? And the reason that I married these two is because every generation says there's something the matter. You know, if you think that you are in a generation in which everything is perfectly fine and there is no change that's occurred, you feel as if you've been sort of left out. So every individual believes that they're in a moment of enormous change or enormous problems. And what I wanted to show, and that's what much of the book is about, is that in fact, there's been enormous progress, and that we don't know that. We stand at a juncture and we say something is the matter without looking back and saying, you know, it's not that bad as it once was, or this is where we came from. This is the journey that we have taken, and these are the reasons why there has been change. So the first thing that I want this book to say is there has been a lot of progress, and the second thing is, but we're not there.
Right, and it seems like the progress is one that is continuous, right? So I think some people might think that the progress is kind of up and down, but you highlight how even in the 1950s, where I think the popular perception is that all educated women were living these sterile lives as housewives, right? And that's sort of the myth of the feminine mystique. You highlight that when you look at the data, right, it seems like, you know, women were working at higher rates. They were creating career paths for themselves. It's just that they were marrying younger and having children younger. So why is it that we maybe fail to recognize this progress, this continuous progress?
I think that it's true with just about everything that we think about, that we don't look back and say we have seen progress. And I think that there's an interesting mindset why that's the case. If we say, oh, everything is fine because we have progressed up this hill, we don't realize that there's still a top to the hill that we still must climb together. I think that that's the reason. I don't put any blame on anyone for it. And of course, the other thing, which you will know better than anyone, is that history isn't studied by everyone. It's difficult. History is messy. And so we don't want to study history because we have to come to grips with lots of moments when we took the possibly wrong path, or we have to, you know, master a tremendous amount of facts that, you know, that we don't want to. We want to live in the present. I am often asked, the question that I get the most is, what is the future going to look like? And my answer is always, that's why I'm a historian, because I don't predict the future, but I can backcast, and that's hard as well. Going back in time and understanding how we got to here from there is just as hard.
But you know what economists are really good at is, right, showing how an aggregate outcome comes about as a result of individual choices made under constraints, right? With, you know, with preferences and norms. And I think that's really what you do with the book. And you try to disentangle, right? You know, what are the shifts in preferences? What are the shifts in opportunity costs? And what are the shifts in constraints? And at the very beginning, of course, you talk about some of the legal restrictions against women working in different careers, most of which, of course, have been, you know, eliminated, including these marriage bans and these nepotism bans. And I was wondering if you could talk about them, because I wasn't really clear on why we had them, right? I mean, yes, social norms, but as an economic historian, I'm always looking for, who's benefiting from this, right? I mean, clearly the incumbent workers want to keep out the, new entrants, but why, particularly in, say, the teaching professions where, you needed to have these women working, why would they have these marriage bans?
Because you guys were a problem. Okay, so think about, so we had in 1920, when we first can count them, 120,000 or more school districts. Some of them were very large, and some of them were becoming unified, like New York City and Los Angeles and Chicago. But most of them were these tiny little places. Okay, think Little House on the Prairie. Go back to that. And so it was pretty easy to attract young people, women, to be teachers. And when they got married, two things happened. Okay. The first thing is that in these pretty small districts, you now had someone who was going to argue with the school board and be the agent for the teacher. That's her husband. She was docile. She was young and docile, and now she has an individual who's going to advocate for her for higher wages and better conditions. How about that stove in the little schoolhouse that wasn't operating well in the wintertime? Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that she's going to become pregnant pretty quickly. And so you can think about marriage bans originating with the fact that these school districts didn't find it very difficult to attract teachers. And let me just say that when they did, they relaxed them. And these were often not even sort of written down in ways that we can even find them today. So being a historian and trying to track these marriage bars is a difficult process. So the first thing is that when the supply was pretty elastic, these school districts had these bans, and they said, we're going to fire you when you get married, and we're not going to hire you if you are married. And it was very easy for them to do, number one. Number two, they probably were going to get rid of this teacher anyhow when she became pregnant. And if they didn't get rid of her, she was going to get rid of herself, okay? But whenever we see historically a problem with supply, these marriage bars and these marriage bans, go away very, very quickly.
Right. So it was in, I think, World War II when the demand for female labor, right, became quite strong, that a lot of these fell away. I was surprised.
A lot of these fell away, but remember I said that history is messy. Well, the period of World War II was preceded by the Great Depression, 10 years, so that even in 1940, unemployment rates were extremely high, okay? So when unemployment rates are high, the first people to be told that, we don't want to hire you are going to be, let's face it, various minority groups, including women.
Yeah. I was surprised to see that there were these marriage bans persisted in some professions, like flight attendants, right? And it was only after they wanted to start hiring married male flight attendants that they were forced to get rid of these.
Right. That's a very famous Supreme Court decision, right? But, I mean, it's a very funny one because I think it was Delta made the mistake of, so there was always an out in terms of discrimination law if you had a bona fide occupational qualification, okay? And so what the airlines did was said, oh, there's a BFOQ to hire women in these positions and to also hire single women in these positions. And then they went and they hired, in the Honolulu run, they hired a group of, quote, Native Hawaiian men for, believe it or not, they actually said for color, which they didn't mean the shade of the person's skin, but for, to create a festive atmosphere. And the Supreme Court then, of course, said, look, this is no longer a BFOQ, you just hired men. And so they sort of outlawed a whole bunch of things having to do with the airlines hiring only women, only single women, only attractive, only of certain weight and height and et cetera, as long as it wasn't considered a BFOQ.
Now, when you talk about kind of the trade-offs between career and family, I mean, really what you're talking about are the trade-offs between kind of a career outside of the household and kind of a career inside of the household. But no one ever talks about kind of household work as a career. And certainly, in the aggregate economic data, right, we don't include domestic work as part of, GDP. Why is that? I mean, why do we not recognize kind of being a head of house or head of domestic household or, housewife as a profession, as a career, as an occupation? Why is it that we kind of prioritize working for money or working outside of the household?
Once again, because it's messy. I mean, the person who pioneered national income accounting, one of the most boring fields you can ever imagine, and he himself found it boring. He wanted to get out of that business, and I'm referring to the great Nobel laureate Simon Kuznets. Okay, he eventually got out of that business, although he won the Nobel Prize for that, and went into the field of economic growth and economic development. He and many others would say that we should include it, but there are lots of things that we should include. There are lots of ways in which we bias our estimates of national income because of it. Think of the following. Every time I bake a loaf of bread versus buy a loaf of bread, I'm reducing gross national product. And that's because just the labor itself is not being included. Okay, let's forget about the economies of scale, and let's forget about the fact that I'm not going to bake bread and you wouldn't want to eat it. But that's, and as historians, as economic historians, this is really big. I mean, it's extremely big when the sewing machine comes in and clothes are being produced, and this is a big sector of the economy, are being produced in factories rather than at home. They're still being produced at home, but they're being produced more in factories now, whereby it's the national income. It's not just washing pots and pans. It's not just taking care of the kids. It's a whole bunch of other things. And it's not as if we shouldn't include them, because in fact, Kuznets and his student, Bob Gorman, who is another University of Pennsylvania person, and of course, Simon was a University of Pennsylvania person. I know that Greg is University of Pennsylvania. That they attempted to include and did include many of these items in their estimates of gross national product. But to do that for this larger sector, which is all household production and the care of children, the care of elderly, et cetera, is just a monumental task. And it's a monumental task simply in terms of how to do it, let alone, the theory about how to do it, let alone the data. But it's not as if it shouldn't be done.
Well, you talk a bit about sort of technological shocks throughout this period. And, at the beginning of the period, the household work changed dramatically because of the introduction of electrification and appliances. And so that kind of freed up supply, but also on the demand side, you talked about this, white collar revolution, right? And this surge in demand for clerical work, which led to expansion of high schools and sucked a lot of women into the workforce, right? But again, this is limited to college educated women. I've spent time.
No, high school. Well, my book is, but
your
that
book
movement, as you just said, is really the movement of women from high school into clerical jobs.
Right, because I mean, I spent some time. My father in Philadelphia had worked at a clothing company, and there was a factory that I spent some time working in as a kid. And of course, most of the people who worked in this factory were women, and most of them were married women, and so there was a lot of female labor participation in the sort of non-college educated. So how did these technological shifts seem to have affected the college educated at a higher rate?
Yeah, but Greg, if we use the census, if we use all the documents that we could pull together, yes, there are women working in factories, and those women will report that they're operatives, and I can code them. But at the end of the day, the labor force participation for white women, even those who are immigrants, even those with immigrant parents, is extremely low in 1900 and 1910, and it's beginning to climb in about 20 and 30, but it's still extremely low. For black women, it's higher for lots of different reasons.
Right, and then you fast forward to the 70s, and you talk about this quiet revolution. So what's the difference? I mean, we hear about a lot of activism, right? Feminist activism, which was driving a lot of the changes. The quiet revolution was sort of happening in the background, driven by economic forces, right?
Yeah, well, it was also driven by the pill.
Yeah.
So the in fact the change from what I call Group 3 to Group 4 that said, so Group 3 said, well, we're going to have family first and then a job, and I'm going to plan for that. And then Group 4 suddenly, almost without warning, around the late 60s, early 70s, says, nope, and this is college women, nope, I'm going to have a career, I'm going to cement that. And then I'm going to have family, because after all, having family is really simple. Look at the baby boom. No one had any trouble producing, 3 children. So I'm not going to have any problem. I'm going to delay having family. I'm going to delay marriage. And the pill was a mighty force in allowing society to accept the fact that later marriage and an active sex life were perfectly fine together.
And we fast forward to the present, and I think a lot of the book, probably the entire second half of the book, is really focused on the kind of gender wage gap. And we all talk about 81 cents, right? I think that's the number that we all talk about now. And
increase it to 83.
83 cents. And I think many of us see this as a problem, and we're all kind of fishing around for explanations. And you kind of walk through some of the explanations that most people immediately think of, and you highlight how a lot of them are inadequate to explain these differences. Even I think the one that a lot of economic folks would point to, which is occupational segregation, and you highlight how even if we were to reassign the male and female employees into sort of identical occupations, we would still have this substantial gap because there's lots of heterogeneity. There's still male-female gaps within these different professions. And you say this is driven primarily by kind of greedy jobs. So tell us, what exactly is a greedy job?
Yeah, so let's walk through this, because it is the case that men and women, black and white, we have many, many different ways of slicing the society and the labor force up, are often in different jobs in different sectors. And it is also the case that the way in which the BLS produces this number of the gender gap, the average gender gap, it's about 83 cents on the dollar. But if we just peer into a single sector, let's say the finance sector, investment banking, HR, if we peer into that through the lens of taking everyone who earned an MBA from a particular school, so we're holding a lot of things constant, we will see that men and women exit this prestigious MBA school they exit with their MBAs, and they earn about the same. And then after about 10 to 15 years, women don't earn 83 cents on the male dollar. They earn about 56 cents on the male dollar. Okay. So, in fact, in occupations that are those that we think of as the most prestigious, in which earnings are the highest, in fact, women earn much, much less relative to the male dollar after some period. Now, I can also do that little experiment with women who have children over that period or don't have children. So I can sort of shock them with a kid, and we would see that it's really the the child, the family responsibilities that lead to these large differences. So women who, through that period, haven't had children or haven't had family responsibilities, perhaps with elderly parents, earn more or less about the same as what their male colleagues are earning, those peers with whom they left this prestigious business school. It's not the one that you've taught at, I don't think, but it's a very prestigious one. And so then we ask, what's going on? Well, this set of occupations are very greedy occupations, and children take time. And so if you have an MBA and you're thinking about going into a particular one of these occupations in this sector, and you know that you cannot commit to traveling every other weekend, you're not going to be you're not going to be doing M&As, for example, because you know that prior to the pandemic, and we should discuss that you're going to have to travel. And so the greedy jobs are the ones that pay the most for additional hours, for maybe not even additional hours, but your weekends, your vacations, that demand that you be on the road, that you be up in the air. And so those are the ones that women disproportionately, and for reasons that have to do with social norms, can't take. And so therefore, in different sex couples, there is a decision that we're not going to have couple equity. I'm going to take the flexible job, and you're going to take the greedy job. And so by removing the fact that we have gender equity, we sort of throw, by removing the fact that we no longer have couple equity, we throw gender equity under the bus. And so that's really the story.
So it's really not a gender gap as much as it is a motherhood gap, right? Because it's the women that choose to start a family that are driving these differences over time, right?
By and large, I mean, there's still a gender effect, and some of the gender effect may be because they're also parents, and we know that daughters take care of their parents personally more than sons do, who often take care of their parents by writing large checks. And in addition, there's still a gender gap even without this. And part of it is because women may believe that they're going to step into these roles, and at the end of the day don't. So there are also the issues of expectational norms as well.
So it's really a consequence of household level decision making then, right? So there's at the household level, the choice to pursue that extra income can only happen as the price you have to pay is that you sacrifice gender equity within the household?
Right. I mean, one could just think about, as I do in the book, I have a couple modeled after a real couple who sit down and they realize that they've both taken jobs that are high powered jobs. They now have a child, and something's got to give. And so they think, well, we can both take the flexible job and have couple equity. And also, that also adds to gender equality in the entire economy. But if we did that, we'd be leaving how many tens of thousands of dollars on the table? And so they look at that and they think, we really want a 50-50 life, but is it worth that amount of money? And so what this tells us is that if we could close that amount, then given that couples want gender equity, they will purchase it if it's cheaper. But if work is greedy,
it really requires a concerted effort on the part of the employer. You talk about there being these principal agency problems, right? How can, say, a consulting firm or a bank change the workplace environment? Can they do that without sacrificing their place on the kind of leaderboard and the totem pole when they're competing against the other banks?
Two things. Number one, it's sort of interesting that we talk about a leaky pipeline when in fact it's a better way of thinking about the pipeline is that it's not leaking. It's that it's been made so convoluted. It has twists and turns that it's impeding. It's not as if women are leaking out. They're just being impeded from going forward. Whether or not there are ways of solving this within firms, I can certainly come up with lots of ways to solve it. As I said before, not my job, okay? And it's certainly not my job to make consulting firms more efficient, because it may be closing them down altogether would be better efficiency for the economy. Okay, maybe we should cut that.
Some people might say that.
So, but how do we do that? Well, as I've said many times and said in the book, all you need is one good substitute. And remember, that was the same thing for the pediatrician. It was the same thing for the veterinarian. It was the same thing for the personal banker. So if you have one good substitute, if you have a job that is somewhat greedy, and you need the time for your family, you turn to your doppelganger and you say, you know everything about what I'm doing, just step into the role. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another thing that happened during the pandemic is that it used to be that you had to shake the hand of the person that you were doing the M&A with, even if the person was in Tokyo. You had to be there at the contract signing in Geneva, in Zurich. You no longer have to do that. We discovered, to our amazement, that we could do things a different way. So if you no longer have to fly to Tokyo or Zurich every other weekend, well, then women who were faced not with the leaky pipeline, but with the convoluted pipeline can say, hey, look, I can do that job. I'm smart, I am capable. I don't have to bow out because I'm not the one who can go to Tokyo every other weekend. So are we going to see a change in the future? I really hope so.
Well, one of the things that you point out in the book is that parents, including mothers, spend more time with their children now than they did in the past. And I'm always kind of stunned by this, right? Because, one would think that we would be spending less time, right? Because people have, fewer kids. And that you can outsource so much, particularly, I mean, if the wealthier you are, right? People talk about the lack of availability of childcare, but when you're fairly wealthy, child care is more affordable than when you're, less wealthy. So why aren't people spending, particularly mothers who have these career options, why are they choosing to spend more time with their children rather than less?
Well, the question is, what are they giving up? And so we have to sort of go back to the uh, the data that we have, the American Time Use Survey, but many of these changes precede that, so we have to go back into the historical work. Some of this comes from a well-known and important piece by Valerie and Gary Ramey called The Rugrat Race. And they have an answer for why it's going on, and it has to do with the same rat race equilibrium to which I referred to before. This is just another part of it. I don't know whether that's a good answer, because we also know from a host of OECD countries that in these countries as well, the more educated parents spend more time with their kids than less educated parents. And that has increased over time as education has increased for the parents. So part of it is that we really want to know what parents who are spending more time with their kids were doing before. And it may be that, they were going to sports events before and now they're going to their kids' sports events. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Well, I guess, last question we can wrap up is the bigger question, which is, we talk about gender equity, right? As if it's unquestionably a good thing in the way we've defined it. But, why couldn't we argue that, the women who have decided to kind of check out of this rat race and avoid these greedy jobs, I mean, that seems pretty wise. I mean, that seems like they figured it out. Why the men just haven't wisened up that maybe they should be following in the footsteps of these women and kind of avoiding this rat race. Why do we see this as necessarily a problem rather than just a difference in lifestyle choice or preference?
Well, the press and commentators may see it as a problem, and many people may see it as a problem. I would emphasize that I want to relax constraints. We talked about constraints and preferences. We talked about preferences and norms and beliefs. So my goal is to make certain that people are unconstrained by the various constraints that we think of as economists in terms of the budget constraint or in terms of other types of educational constraints. There are a host of different ways in which people can be constrained. And I also would much rather that people aren't constrained by norms that are no longer have a function. Norms arise because they have a function, and then they're often kept in place and enforced by generations of people. We often call our parents and our grandparents. And it would be very, very good if these norms changed as fast as society is changing. So I think that if that is that is my goal, and if that goal then leads more women to have careers and to have equitable relationships with whomever they are sharing their life with, then that would be a very good thing.
Claudia, thanks so much for joining me and discussing this. This is a really, really wonderful book. It's called Career and Family. And there's just so much fascinating information in here. And, you plow through all these databases, which illustrates so much about our lives, our careers, and our family life. Thanks for joining me.
And thank you very, very much for a great, entertaining time with you.
This is unSILOed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.